6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. 275 pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
Prepare yourself for a world of science. This is
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Science Nights in the morning. We have two nights assembled today and a very special guest, Dr. Sean Graham, biologist extraordinaire, and Dr. Thomas Shiller, paleontologist. And we have a very special guest all the way from Mexico. And Ciprian Ardelean is here on the show with us. And Ciprian, how are you doing?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm very well. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting.
Oh, yeah. Well, hey, we're excited to talk to you. And I'm going to let the Knights, I know the Knights have a lot of questions. I have a few questions myself. We're going to go ahead and get right on into the show. And I'm going to let Sean Graham just kind of take it over. He's the one who reached out to you, and you were gracious enough to, answer the call and be on the show today. And I really appreciate it. We all do. And we're getting ready to be educated about our history, human history.
Yeah. And this is such a cool topic and such a great guest. You're a great guest for us because we do have on our show, being in West Texas, and Tom and I being so interested in some of the stuff in northern Mexico. I'm a herpetologist, so I love getting to Mexico to do field work. And Thomas digs dinosaurs in northern Mexico. And so we're all kind of interested in the Chihuahuan Desert here. And, of course, this find is just huge for this region. This is a major find of human prehistory that's going to push the envelope of our understanding of, man in the New World, right? Humans in the New World. And I saw it was in Nature, and I was like, oh, wow, this is just unbelievable. And then I was like, well, I'm going to give this a shot. Let's talk to this guy. Maybe he'll want to talk to us. He's right down the road, so to speak, down in Zacatecas. Yeah. So why don't you, if you wouldn't mind, Ciprian, paint the picture of kind of what the state of the art was in terms of our understanding of when humans got to North America before, more or less, your big find that you've just reported recently in the most prestigious scientific journal in the world.
Well, finds like this don't go very easy into acceptance. It takes them quite a while to be accepted by the scientific community and then be absorbed by the public. I mean, it's when finds like this happen, they are normally discarded. Mm-hmm. So it's been more than 2 years that we've been working on this paper before being accepted in Nature, and it was a strategic move on our side because we wanted this kind of discoveries to be taken seriously, and you can see how the social and academic psychology works when something happens in nature, right? It's not like publishing your find like the archaeologists usually do in the chapter of an edited book. That's what we normally do. We normally take the shortcut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Archaeology it's not always among the hard sciences. We are more like on the humanities side. So we have a different sort of managing the results and the public reach of the results. So we used to go to other sorts of journals, or we publish our own books and so on. And most of the times that kind of publications get lost, get completely shadowed by other sorts of finds. So when something like that makes it into Nature, it causes a massive uproar, and it was absolutely shocking for us to see how a tremendous scandal it created worldwide, and those who react with more skepticism in front of this kind of science are not scientists, it's the public. Because, it's for some reason, everybody seems to know about archaeology. You have your uncle, your neighbor, your colleague at work, the taxi driver. Everybody seems to know about archaeology.
So everybody knows about Clovis people and the Clovis culture. Like you'll run into people in the streets down in Zacatecas, and they know that So that's the kind of background here is that, and I know that I've read that the Clovis culture, is the first undisputed, right until now, undisputed evidence of humans in the New World. These really beautifully made spear points, projectile points associated with Ice Age mammals, right?
Well,
and
the very, very end of the Ice Age.
Right.
I mean, Clovis people witnessed the very end of the Ice Age, so they are the last ones.
Mm-hmm.
But they have enough in their sleeve to awe people. So in Mexico, it's a bit different. Here you have all the pyramids, all the massive Mesoamerican civilizations that everybody knows about, and people pay very little attention to prehistory.
Mm-hmm.
But in the United States, especially in New Mexico and Western Texas and all the rest of Texas, which is one of the main homelands of Clovis, there is such a big thing about Clovis. So when you find something that challenges the primacy of Clovis, well, everybody seems to be like offended.
Is there anyone in your profession that is offended by that, or is there any controversy amongst your colleagues?
Most of the people are offended.
Yeah, because when I did a Google search of your work after I read the paper, a lot of what popped up is controversial new paper. Whenever you have the word controversy attached to a paper,
for three reasons.
Okay.
That's what happens for three reasons. And when we are kind of divagating now from your question earlier, but I will go back to it soon. So the reasons why this has caused such a big controversy that will last for years is first because it talks about very old ages.
Yeah.
And
So for our audience, real quick before we get into that, tell us about the ages. So Clovis about 12,000, 14,000.
Yeah. So Clovis started, archaeologically speaking, because you can never know when they actually started in real life.
Yeah.
You can only say about when your data tell you it started. So the Clovis people started somewhere around 13,600 years ago.
And your artifacts are
quite
a bit earlier than that.
12,600 or 12,800 more or less when the last cold push of the Ice Age started. It's called the Younger Dryas.
Dryas, yeah.
So that's when the Clovis ends. So for many years, it's been considered this was the first culture, and you have these huge Clovis settlements in the southern U.S., and the biggest ones ever known is in Gault, in Florence, right, in the Bell County. So that's the biggest settlement of the Clovis people. But in the same place, we already have much older human presence. So during the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, pre-Clovis occupation has been widely accepted. So Clovis first has died maybe 25 years ago, right? So everybody in the academia accepts pre-Clovis occupation, but as long as it's not older than 16,000.
Okay. And just real quick, what are the dates of your site?
Well, the dates of my site are nothing strange, but the people read it as being strange. So I have two stratigraphic and cultural components, a younger one and an older one. The younger one goes from about 16,000 years ago to more or less 12,000 years ago. That's component B. The older one, component C, goes back from 16,000, more or less, apparently towards 30,000 euros.
Wow.
Boom.
Twice as
Well,
old. As,
Okay, now what's wrong with 16,000? How come everyone gets squirrely if you go older than 16?
16,000 is the new threshold. Everything in the American prehistoric thinking, and by American we understand the whole continent, everything goes by the acceptance of thresholds. For some reason, from the very start of this business and of working with very ancient human presence on the continent, everything had to do with where you set the bar. So unlike Europe, Asia, Australia, Africa, where everybody speaks very freely about very old dates, and then you read another news that, the Homo sapiens was pushed back for another 100,000 years in Africa, and everybody's like, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that was never part of the academic behavior in the Americas, never.
Uh-huh.
So from the very beginning of this studies at the very end of the 19th century, during the entire 20th centuries and until today, everybody has to do with the acceptance of a threshold. So it has a huge psychological component. So people are just not accepting dates if they go beyond what a paradigm tells you.
Yeah, I read that the first Clovis finds, everybody was skeptical about the Folsom sites and the Clovis sites, saying, hell no, those just happen to be there next to the mammoths, and they weren't actually hunting them.
It's always the same.
Yeah,
It's always the same with any find that challenges the established paradigm at the moment. So people who are working Clovis, most of the people who do Clovis on a daily basis, or Folsom, or everything that's very, very late Paleo-Indian groups, they are kind of in love with those cultures, and they feel like they shouldn't be threatened or removed from their pedestals. You know, it's very similar to what happens with the psychology of dog people and cat people.
Yeah. Camps.
Cat people hate dogs, and dog people hate cats.
Yeah.
You know, so
this is great, because I love, a lot of people don't realize that scientists have holy cows. We do.
Yes, and they are holier than in India here.
Yeah. They're and it's totally it's not something most people would ever have predicted, but scientists will get attached to some paradigm, and they'll get in verbal arguments with each other about these things.
They get attached to the figures who help those paradigms to be installed. So Clovis first was a paradigm at some point. It fell during the 90s. Pre-Clovis is the current paradigm, as long as you don't go beyond 16,000.
Wow. You're setting those thresholds.
And in the 16,000 threshold, does that have something to do with the closure of that ice-free corridor up in Beringia?
If you look at most of the sites who have strong data supporting pre-Clovis evidence, the oldest dates that belong to widely accepted sites don't go beyond, or don't go too much beyond 16,000.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's just an average.
It's sort of an average, and also has to do with the late effects of the end of the LGM, of the last glacial maximum, which was the very peak of the last glaciation, and that happened between more or less 27,000 years ago, calibrated in average, until about 18,000 years ago. But in many places, the effects of that termination of the last glacial peak took about 2,000 years to be manifested. So 16,000 is a real, an objective threshold in chronostratigraphically speaking. So, and also most people say, okay, we can give you 18,000 because if you have people south, everything is just a negotiation. And sometimes
That's hilarious.
in archaeology, there is no such thing as objective truth or objective reality. There is only lost arguments and won arguments.
Oh, wow.
So,
Sounds a little bit like paleontology too.
Yeah, I was going to
sometimes.
say.
Yeah.
of course.
And,
So,
and in areas where you could never possibly know the real answer, right? Because it's already happened, and the evidence isn't there either way. Like, I think paleontologists argue a lot about things that they maybe never will find out.
Yeah.
Because they're only going to have a skeleton.
Yeah, the T-Rex is the big holy cow of paleontology, right? whether or not it was a predator or a scavenger.
Right.
And I think it was arrived upon that it could have been a little bit of both.
Yeah.
That's what people agree
Well,
on.
there's no doubt that it had tiny little forearms that were ridiculous.
Yeah.
Tiny.
Working on that
Embarrassing.
tone. Working on the tone there. Well, we have about 4 more minutes. And Ciprian, I would like to ask you now, wasn't there a faunal extinction about 13,000 years ago that would actually kind of contribute to possible hunting by humans?
that is an assumption based on data from the United States.
Okay. All right.
So they rarely take into account tropical latitudes. For example, in the area of Zacatecas, which is exactly, the Zacatecas Desert is the southernmost outskirt of the Chihuahuan Desert. So you are on the northern side of the Chihuahuan Desert. My work is on the very south side of the Chihuahuan Desert. So in that area, apparently all megafauna has disappeared around 40,000 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So everything you find, like mammoth bones, bison bones, everything that's megafauna, that corresponds to the terminology of megafauna in that area is never younger than that.
Wow. Yeah, the faunal remains that you got from the cave are super interesting because it kind of reads off like a perfect modern Mexico fauna. Like if you could have a Mexico fauna where it wasn't overhunted, it kind of reads off that way. And I love that you found vampire bats in the cave. Are there still vampire bats in it? Because there's remains of them. Do you still get them there?
Yes, there are, and you can see the part of their regurgitations, bloody regurgitations on the walls and things like that. And Dr. Arroyo, who works with us, he's also a specialist in bats. He always pays attention to these details everywhere he goes with us. And our cave shows a fauna in a world that seems to have lost the megafauna.
Already. Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, because what you're bringing up there is the timing. This idea, right?
Well, there's a disparity between is it climate or is it humans?
Right.
Like what could have caused this glitch?
It was
right.
climate with a final blow by humans in areas where there were enough humans and very few animals.
Right.
And there's also a behavioral thing. For example, if you look at populations who lived at the same time with Clovis, like the Western Sturmed in Western U.S. in the Rockies, they are not fans of killing mammoths. So all this megafauna thing seems to be like a behavior of Clovis people and some other cultures who share that kind of behavior, and probably for other coeval groups it looked weird.
Yeah, I've always the overkill. What we're talking about here, we call the overkill hypothesis. The idea that Stone Age man wiped out populations of megafauna all over the world, and there's supposed to be this timing that goes on. When the Australian, folks colonized Australia, the megafauna there went extinct promptly. If the timing is right, if that hypothesis is correct, then that's how it checks out. But I've always they didn't drive the spruce trees extinct, and that lived in Kansas during the Pleistocene. They weren't doing that. I've always had problems with the details. The devil's in the details. And speaking of details, we have to take a quick break. So hopefully Ciprian will stick around with us, and you'll hear a word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back, everybody. Science Nights in the Morning. Hello, everybody. Science Nights in the Morning are back with our very special guest, Ciprian from the University of Zacatecas. And he just hit pay dirt scientifically, literally, down in a crazy cave in this remote area of Zacatecas, where he's discovered evidence for human beings in the Western Hemisphere long before most people have kind of been comfortable with recognizing, right? As old as 30,000 years ago. And it's really well documented. The paper is beautiful. It's full of incredible illustrations, really well done, and it's in the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. So you got to take it seriously. And this sounds like a serious guy. Cyprian, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit. You've got a lot of evidence in this paper about what you call faunal remains, and also, floral remains. So bits and pieces of plants and animals that are buried in this cave that you dug up, that kind of paint a picture of what the environment was like at the time when these folks were living in this, maybe not necessarily living in the cave, but visiting the cave and leaving behind artifacts. What was it like back then?
So we actually have very little evidence in terms of the number of items recollected from the excavation that's reported in this paper. So there will be a second paper coming, hopefully, next year with the excavations from last year, which are not reported in the Nature paper.
Ooh.
So there's more that I cannot talk about. But
oh my goodness, that's exciting.
More and more exciting.
Because I was thinking, man, what if he found a Clovis point above the horizon where they were digging?
Wow.
And it was actually placed in context. It would be like the golden egg.
You're trying to tease it out of it.
Yeah. What if it was that cool?
The Holy Grail.
Could it have been that cool?
Probably your audience should know that there are no Clovis points in Mexico.
I should probably know that. That was one of the coolest things that I learned from reading.
The only Clovis points here are at the two big Clovis locations in Sonora, but they belong to the Arizona Clovis clusters. Just the border happens to pass north of them. But south of that, you have some dubious reports of Clovis points that probably are not even Clovis, or probably they're not even legitimate finds. Mm-hmm. So hunter-gatherers during the Ice Age had defined territories. So if you want to look for Chinese, it's very likely that you find them in China. So if you look for Americans, you will find them in America. Mm-hmm. So if you look for Clovis people, you will find them more or less on the territory of the United States, but not south of that. So the Chiquihuite cave is very far away from Clovis territories, like 1,000 kilometers away from Clovis territories. And speaking of distances, during the last glacial maximum, the cave was just about 2,000 kilometers away from the southern edge of the big glacial sheets. So the environment was obviously very different from what you see today in northern Zacatecas. Extremely different, at least for the time that we studied at this cave. So caves like this that are very high in the mountains, you cannot expect them to be very full of floral and fauna remains, because it depends on what kind of animals would live at that height and what kind of vegetation would grow at that altitude. So it's not like having a cave somewhere near the riverbed where basically the wind can blow in all sorts of vegetation from all sorts of ecosystems and niches. In high altitude caves, things are more selective. So even for the people who use that cave, one of the critiques that we receive from both academics and the public is, why don't you have like big animal bones with scratch marks and everything? Because in the first place, you would not carry a whole carcass up the steep slopes from the valley all the way to the cave. So it's almost 4 hours walking on a slope that's 45 degrees. So you would butcher the animals elsewhere and take the lightweight, boneless meat, right?
Sure.
So you are leaving most of the bones out of the record. So the animals that you have at the cave are basically animals who would live around that location, and definitely there are not grasslands herbivores. If you want to hunt a grassland herbivore like deer, pronghorn antelope, a mammoth, or whatever, you have to leave the cave, go down around the lakes that were in the middle of the basin back then, go around the swamps, the marshes, and hot springs that were abundant all over the place in the lowlands, do the hunting, do the butchering, and go back with the selected pieces back to the cave, not dragging the whole animal up the slope. I mean,
Sure.
It's logical, right?
Right. It makes sense.
The kind of archaeological record that this kind of sites would provide is very different from the typical Paleo-Indian hunting locations that people are used to. You know? Well, so the environment around that cave changed, obviously, between the glacial maximum and times afterwards, before the cave was sealed by massive collapses and the occupation finished. But it's basically a forest with grasses and flowers. It looked pretty much like today's Washington State, Oregon, British Columbia.
Pacific Northwest, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just in that kind of environment.
Yeah, coniferous forest.
Yeah, Douglas firs and big pines and some oaks and some flowery grasses here and there. That's the kind of vegetation we had there.
Wow.
So nothing to do with the Joshua trees and the cacti that you have today.
Yeah. And there's pictures in your paper of the site now, and there is like a yucca right in the foreground.
Right.
It looks like the stuff you see around here. It's kind of grassy.
You still have some pinyon trees today, but there were no pinyon trees back then. There were different sorts of coniferous trees.
And you contribute that more to climate than anything, right? Just the change basically over time.
And there's something else. There was water near the cave, because people say, how would anybody live there if there is no water? There is no water today, but there was plenty of water in the past. I mean, you can actually see the cliffs outside the cave shaped by waterfalls that were coming from above the cliffs.
This probably would have been from ice and snow melt back then.
Well, there were probably springs. And right beneath the slope, at the end of the last flight of the slope, there was a creek. I mean, actually, the path our caravans use today to go to the cave is an ancient creek fed by a spring. That spring is no longer alive, but it was most likely during the Ice Age.
A lot more rainfall at that latitude. You're painting a picture of a kind of a nice place. It sounds nice.
It was a nice place, yeah.
Yeah.
And the cave was different because the entrance was huge, like a massive 50 meters wide vault, about 10 meters tall, and allowing the light to get in, and probably it was as isothermic as is today with stable temperature inside, and but much more light coming in during the day. During the Younger Dryas, at some point, everything collapsed. I mean, maybe erosion, maybe some earthquake, or who knows, but most of the entire entrance of the cave was completely sealed, was completely buried by debris. Probably a single event that happened in minutes. And the entrance you use today to go into the cave was cut open by mining explorers from the 18th century. So we are using an artificial entrance dug through the debris that sealed the ancient entrance.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do
that's
you think
amazing.
this was a relatively permanent settlement? Do you, when
No.
looking, no,
No, absolutely not.
no.
We have very few artifacts to talk about the
So there's
permanent settlement.
so there's more evidence that they were nomadic, probably just like
Well, everybody was nomadic during the Ice Age.
Okay.
And probably they had very large migration territories. Something like, I mean, if you look at the caribou herders, the Inuits or so on, they move on such huge circular territories that it's the grandson's turn to go back to the point where his grandfather started as a youngster. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Especially
it
because
was
his
like-
grandfather is 34 years old, right?
Today, I mean, these are calculations based on today migration routes from the 20th century.
Yeah.
So it takes them 3 generations to close a circle. So for people who are barely becoming familiar with a new territory, it may take a while to define which your territory is, why you will continue to exploit the region and why not, etc. So probably this cave was a mandatory visitation spot for a few days at a time during specific migration routes. And probably they did some very specific activities at this place, because we don't see the entire spectrum of activities of a normal stable camp. I mean, there is much more to be discussed in the next paper. We will include the user analysis of the tools. We will give the interpretation and the exact explanation of what they were used for. But this is something important. The environment for people who occupy a region should not be thought of only in terms of vegetation and animals and climate. You need to think about the geology. So in this part of the continent, you have a very different geology, like than in comparison with Texas, where you have, I mean, just crossing the border from Texas, you have the amazing agatas from the Alibates sources. You have the Edwards Church from Central and Eastern Texas. You have amazing geology of jaspers and chalcedony and everything that's wonderful, right? And all this popular culture of the flea nappers, which is so loved by the Americans. Well, everybody is like completely blinded by the beautiful rocks, and they never think about the fact that the earliest people on the continent were still far away from discovering these rocks.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to use what the geologists gave them at the first site, which was limestone.
So they're fashioning tools out of limestone.
Limestone, basalts, and rhyolites. That's what you can see when you look around. To find the other materials in a very poor geology like northern Zacatecas, it takes you many years of exploration and familiarization with the region to be able to find those tiny sources of chert. So people at the cave had access to nearby sources of green limestones that behave exactly like cherts, right? Mm-hmm. So they use them, but the very important thing here for the audience to understand is that limestone was in use as a tool source, as a tool raw material until the conquest, until the Spanish conquest.
Hmm.
So you can have sites that are 500 years old and they still flake limestone.
Wow.
That's
so they use limestone for certain activities that where it doesn't matter too much if the tool breaks, like wood chopping, bark removal, etc. While hunting and other sorts of activities is reserved for chert or some other sort of more expensive material. because you need a tool to last longer and be more precise. But this behavior of focusing on limestone is something that many people in the United States don't have any idea about.
Yeah,
because
I would never have thought that.
So much focus on fancy stones, right? So, but here where we are working, we discover, I mean, this cave is only one from 35 archaeological sites we discovered in the area, and all of them are 90% made of limestone tools.
And it's all local limestone collected nearby.
Exactly. I mean, sometimes they are making bifaces out of limestone a few meters away from the limestone outcrop.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting, because one of the things that's always fascinated me, I'm not an archaeologist, but I spend a lot of time kind of traipsing around out in the desert, and I see a number of artifacts, projectile points and things. And I'll look at a piece that's made of a material that is only exposed 200 miles away. And when you talk to archaeologists or North American archaeologists about it, they talk trading this valuable material that's used for tool construction. So I guess my question is, is there any evidence that they were trading? It sounds like they were just kind of isolated groups who were collecting material locally and not necessarily trying to find the optimal material for constructing their projectile points and their tools.
Well, 25,000 years ago, do you think there were many people to trade with?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. You just have these little enclaves of people, and they're doing what they can with what they have.
Exactly. I mean, we already have sites in the Carolinas. You have, Topper site that was completely wiped out by critics and never accepted and so on. Well, they have all sorts of tools that look exactly like sites in Brazil. My sites look like sites in Brazil, using exactly the same sort of technological approach, using limestones. Or they focus on quartz, because quartz was the first thing they saw in the area. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you need to get used to the geology to know where to look for materials that are fancier for our standards, like nice cherts or jaspers. But it takes centuries for the people to learn to read the geology of their region, especially if they don't live there all the time, because they were just passengers through those regions until territories became smaller and smaller because the demographies increased. So you have groups defining more and more territories that had to coexist. And when the territory becomes smaller, that's when you pay more attention to the landscape, and that's when you are forced to look for alternatives. But we are talking about an alien world here that has nothing to do with the thinking that we see among Clovis people.
Yeah, as you're talking about this, I'm trying to put myself in these people's shoes, and I can just imagine how, like you said, experiencing a new and alien world, having come from such a different place, from the northern latitudes, and then your people end up down in Mexico and ultimately into Central America and South America and disperse that way. It's pretty cool to think about.
So here the thing is that this is not the first site that claims these ages or this sort of technology.
Right.
There have already been several other discoveries, but they are not taken into account by the mainstream.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're going to touch on that when we come back from a break, because we got to put this study and your discovery in context, because this, like you said, this is just now going to be kind of a piece of the puzzle, and a very vocal piece of the puzzle. And I think you've been hinting at something about maybe what you think could have happened in that time gap between 30,000 years ago when your folks were living in that cave, and then all of a sudden these remarkably well-made spear points turn up in North America. And there's a big time, kind of a hole in the time between those two cultures. So where the hell did Clovis come from if there were already people here for 10,000 years? Let's touch on those questions when we get back from the break. Welcome back, everybody. We're the Science Nights in the morning. We got our very special guest. We're talking about prehistory in North America, how old man in the New World is exactly, and when we got here and how. Things like that. Great stuff. We got a special guest from the University of Zacatecas who just made an astounding new discovery. And it's not like he was just talking about, it's not the first time anybody's found something this old. It's just that, people have been just not taking it as seriously. Many other sites. So quickly just kind of run down some of the other sites that are kind of this old and give us an idea of, does this change our minds about how we think that people got to the New World? What was the way that people migrated in from Asia?
Yeah, so here's the thing. There are sites from Yukon to South America that have comparable dates. Not in Alaska, because normally in order to find a site, you need to look for it.
People aren't looking in Alaska?
No, people are not looking in Alaska.
They're surviving in Alaska.
Yeah, it's a little bit remote up there.
They are not looking in Alaska at sites of this age.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the Canadians were always a bit more free in terms of thinking. So they found Bluefish Caves, and Bluefish Caves in northern Yukon has been recently evaluated, and actually the University of Kansas is re-evaluating the site as we speak, and probably there will be some good news from there. And the dates indicate that you have humans around 26,000 years ago in northern Yukon. At the same time, you have humans in central and southwestern Brazil at exactly the same date, 26,000, 27,000 years ago. So how is that you have people at such old moments in time so far away between each other and almost equidistantly located in relationship to Chiquihuite? Mm-hmm. So things are more complicated than just a single find in Zacatecas. And actually, we were as stunned as everybody is today when we found these things at the cave. I was not necessarily a supporter of very old age in the Americas, right?
Oh, the truth comes out. You were one of the doubters.
I was one of the doubters.
Wow.
Yeah. So I said, this thing is serious, and I continued to dig, and I involved people from all universities from all over the world. That's why we have 17 institutions involved in that paper, because they said, please come and look at it, because maybe I'm crazy.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So I wanted to expose the site to the scrutiny, because I didn't want this site to be just another cave left on the margins of the discussion because it sounds too old. Right. So there are many things but the discussion is barely starting. So this will, maybe in 10 years, we will remember this conversation today, and we will say, now the paradigm from today was born in those years when the Chiquihuite came out, So the new paradigm in a few years, I call it the fifth paradigm, is humans were here during or before the LGM, the last glacial maximum. So the thing with the origins of these people is far from being clear, and we should not talk about who they are or where they came from before getting some serious evidence, right? Yeah. We can only speculate. So we are speculating now.
Right.
Well, my understanding, just as a hypothesis based on very few data, conjecture, right? My conjecture is that people came into the Americas before the closure of the ice sheets over Canada.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's an awfully long time ago. That's longer ago than your site.
No.
Right?
No, because the sheets only closed about 26,000 years ago.
Oh, okay.
So they had plenty of time to arrive.
Gotcha.
So they arrived, they moved far enough into the continent, and then the sheets closed. So they were trapped south of the sheets. At the same time, there were more groups coming behind them, and they were trapped north of the sheets. And you have what the archaeologists call the Beringian standstill. And those are the populations who invaded southern latitudes when the sheets retrieved. And those are the founders of the indigenous populations, people who were waiting in Beringia during the LGM, right? But at the same time, there were already people trapped south of the ice sheets, and they had no idea one about the other, right?
Right.
So by the time those people managed to cross into what is United States today, at the end of the LGM, probably about 16,000 years ago, and that's when you start to see a lot of sites with that age, right? 16,000 all over the place, because that's when the northern population started to come in through the ice-free corridor. By that time, the populations who had been here from long before were already disappearing.
Wow.
So it doesn't mean they are lost groups, lost migration. I mean, they had already survived here like for 15,000 years.
Right. Wow.
I mean, it was their time to be, let's say, extinct or just assimilated by these populations,
Right.
culture, genetically, or they just were too few to survive after all that long time that had already survived, you know? So when these massive migrations arrive at the end of the Ice Age, pushed by the climate change into in Siberia and so on, they were invading the continent in big numbers, so that the demography of the pre-LGM populations is completely wiped out. I mean, they are not visible archaeologically.
So
Because they're-
after several thousand years, we have a completely different culture that's taking over North America,
That's
in
my hypothesis. Yes.
that's very cool.
And that's
And-
where we're talking about Clovis. That
Whether they
he's-
came by land or by sea, we're still far away from having sufficient evidence to decide for which route they used. This is still years away from us. But when the Clovis installed, I mean, this was a massive integrated culture. I mean, maybe they spoke different languages. Maybe there were different nations. Because they shared a culture for some reason.
Well, they shared that technology, right?
Yeah,
Right.
their technology is what we can see archaeologically as a human culture. But we cannot see the rest of the culture, like the language,
No.
the beliefs, and so on. So the Clovis were not the only ones at the same time. I mean, there are several other populations who were living at different places in Florida and very far northeast of the U.S. and the northwest, and all these populations were contemporary with Clovis, and they were not Clovis, and they don't even share technologies with Clovis. So with all this diversity that you have at the very end of the Ice Age, you also start to pay attention to the diversity that was before Clovis. Because most of the sites that have pre-Clovis dates, even not as old as ours, they have very different cultures, very different technologies. I mean, almost every pre-Clovis site has a different sort of technology. So that means diversity. That means cultural diversity, and that also could mean, we will never know, but could mean linguistic, ethnical diversity. So who knows if the Clovis was just one people? There were probably many people who shared the same technology as we are able to share the same technology to speak to each other right now. And we are from different nations and different cultures, right? So the thing is that what Clovis left behind is so spectacular, is so amazingly beautiful, so perfect, that it completely blinds the perception of the diversity.
And what you're referring to there are these projectile points, right?
Yeah, the
they're
projectile
just
points and not only the
gorgeous, really well made. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, they're the most kind of difficult projectile points to put together, like the flint nappers that you mentioned, that will try to reconstruct how they made specific spear points. They always talk about Clovis, like they're just so immaculate and crazy. They're hard to make.
The thing is that shows you something very important: the importance of teaching, the importance of transmission of knowledge.
Wow.
Nobody can produce that kind of points without having an amazing professor to teach you to do it.
A PhD.
Yep.
In
So
projectile points.
those people had specialized flint nappers who were absolute artists, and they transmitted the knowledge. When that knowledge is cut because of some cultural change or some population replacement or a war or whatever, people are not able to reproduce those points. So you can actually look at what happened in Mexico, for example, in many regions when the Spanish came. The populations here were completely wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a complete genocide. By the year 1600, all Zacatecas was completely empty of indigenous people. They were completely, all of them were killed or sold away as slaves to the Caribbean islands.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who survived or were left behind, they make tools that look like lower Paleolithic. Why? Because there was nobody.
No one taught them any better.
Teach them.
So there's the lesson, everybody, right there. Knowledge and the transmission of knowledge is very important.
Yeah, I hope some of our students are listening right now.
Well,
Something that I tried to make it clear in our paper, but apparently very few readers are paying attention to it, is that at Chiquihuite we can see teaching. So you can see in the products of flaking on those stones from the cave the same sorts of mistakes and the same sorts of try and error that you can see with our students in the lithics class at university. So people there had youngsters with them, and they were teaching them to flake on a stone that was not as precious as some other exotic material, and they could afford to waste it on learning.
Oh, wow.
That's what Chiquihuite is.
You found a school.
It's a school.
Oh, my God.
Basically, yeah. Wow. One of the earliest universities.
Yeah.
Yeah. People say, yeah, but where is your exotic materials? And I'm like, why do you expect me to find them? I mean, if they're exotic, you would keep them dear to your heart.
Sure.
You would not leave them behind.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
You wouldn't practice on them.
so you would practice with the crap you find around.
Yeah.
So that's what Chiquihuite shows you, and that was the moment when I said, "Oh my God, this is real." When I started to find flakes that show errors on them,
Oh, man.
Wow.
the mistakes of the learning. You know,
How cool. What a great story. Unbelievable. Cyprian, thank you so much for this. This has been, I'm going to nominate you as our all-time best guest
Yeah, I think
we
so.
ever had.
Oh, for sure.
thank
And
you all for letting me start to drool over the microphone.
well, let me tell you right now, we're being broadcast all throughout the Big Bend on KVLF 98.7 FM and on 1240 AM. We're also on the World Wide Web, being streamed all over the country. We have a good following, and what would you like to tell all of our listeners out there that might be looking for this? You inspired me in this conversation.
Future archaeologists.
And I know, you're inspiring future archaeologists and just people wanting that knowledge, what would you like to say to them?
I would like to say to them that you cannot find things if you don't go out to look for them.
I like it.
All right, that's all I need. Sean, let's load up the truck and
Let's
drive
go.
down to Zacatecas.
Let's
You
do it.
need a couple of other diggers?
Wait. So you're saying we can't Google it?
Oh man.
That's one of the things. Archaeology needs to go back outdoors in the dirt, not just sitting in front of the computer.
No doubt. No doubt.
Yeah,
Right?
completely agreed. Dr. Ardelean, I really appreciate it. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for being
been a
on the
good
show.
time.
It means a lot.
Thank you and everybody else listening.
All right, well, everybody, that's the Science Nights in the Morning. We'll see you next week with another great episode.